It is important to note before we begin that the Gospels are indeed anonymous. Now, what does that mean? Because obviously they have authors attached to the titles, right? Technically, no. If you'll notice, it's not like the Gospel of Mark, and this was written by Mark in some kind of fashion. This is the Gospel according to Mark. So the actual person that is writing these things down or writing these Gospels is still anonymous even if you go with the titles, because the titles just say, oh, this is what this eyewitness said. But we also know that it can't be the Gospel according to Mark, Matthew, Luke, or John. These are just ad hoc names that are stapled on to these particular Gospel accounts. And we know this because within the Gospels themselves, they never say where this information comes from other than the scriptures and visions from Jesus. At no point in the Gospel of Mark does the Gospel of Mark say that this information comes from Mark. And the same could be said for the other Gospels. But the original Gospels did not actually have titles. In fact, there's only meant to be one gospel of Jesus. Now, the first gospel written, which we would call the Gospel according to Mark, was then later redacted and copied from in order to rework the gospel and provide a more accurate view of what happened to Jesus, supposedly. And this happened 3 times in the early 1st century that is canonical to the Christian faith. We actually don't get any kind of indication of authorship for these Gospels until Papias in the 2nd century. And there's no way that he could have known who actually wrote these Gospels, considering they were starting to be written in the 70s. One way that we know that Papias is more than likely just pulling names out of his ass or making them up is that he seems to think that there is a Hebrew version of Matthew roaming around out there that then got translated into Greek. What we know now is that Matthew was originally written in Greek because that's what Mark was written in. Now, that's not the entire case against Papias, but basically with Papias, he doesn't cite any kind of references to anyone that might be able to give us accurate authors for these Gospels. He just sort of says that this is who it's from. And this amounts to speculation. And speculation from somebody like Papias, who is known to be wrong about a lot of things and spin hearsay into facts, we probably shouldn't trust his just speculative assertion that these are the people that wrote the Gospels. This isn't my opinion about this. This is actually Bart Ehrman's opinion about this. In any event, Papias does not seem to provide us with the kind of information we can place a lot of confidence in. I should point out in this connection that scholars have almost uniformly rejected just about everything else that Papias is recorded to have said in the surviving references to his works. In addition to this sentiment about Papias, Dr. Bart Ehrman also has this to say about the anonymity of the Gospels.
The striking thing about it is that, of course, none of the Gospels themselves claims to be written by any of those people, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. They're all anonymous. The authors never mention what their names are. And another interesting thing is that when they get quoted early on, they're never named. For example, in none of the Apostolic Fathers, First Clement, Ignatius, the Didache, Polycarp, etc., are these books ever named by apostolic names or even said to be writings by apostles. You mentioned Justin Martyr, but the striking thing of Justin Martyr, of course, is that he quotes Matthew, Mark, and Luke extensively, but never says that they're written by Matthew, Mark, or Luke, and never mentions John either. The only gospel he names by name is the Gospel of Peter. The first time that you have anybody of record talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, our books that we are sure are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is Irenaeus. Now, Irenaeus is writing around the year 185. So even by standard traditional critical datings of the Gospels, this is about 100 years after the Gospels were in circulation. At about the same time, this fragment you mentioned, the Muratorian fragment, I think it's also around the year 180, 185. I think it, like Irenaeus, is closely connected with Rome. And it also mentions by name Luke and John, and it appears to know Matthew and Mark. So what this means is that we don't have early extensive references to these books were being written by apostles. The first time anybody mentions it is 100 years afterwards.
As much as I disagree with Dr. Bart Ehrman on a number of things, I feel like he's got a logically sound case against the authorship of the Gospels.